The stars turned slowly beyond the viewport, cold, distant, and utterly silent. Bryce watched them as the derelict station came into view, like a wound stitched into the black. It hovered there, an old orbital shell fractured at its spine, its docking rings tilted as though frozen mid-collapse. Scars from a war no one talked about anymore. It was supposed to be dead, but the lights were on. A faint glow pulsed along the underbelly of the station, weak, faint, still alive. Bryce muttered under his breath and throttled back. No alarms, no broadcasts. But the presence of power, real, active power, was not what he'd been promised. The client said this place was abandoned, stripped, safe. No life signs, no security, no surveillance. He should have turned back. But he didn't. Smugglers like Bryce didn't survive long by asking questions. The cargo was genetic material, valuable, unclaimed, left behind by whoever had been running the breeding lines during the war. A quick snatch and go. His ship, the Ashfall, had been rigged for stealth. No one would see him come or go. He docked. The airlock hissed like it hadn't opened in years. A dry metallic whine followed, like the groan of a machine that had been waiting too long to breathe. Inside, the corridor lights flickered, cold white strobes along steel-plated walls. Dust danced in the beams, but not much. Too little, actually. The floor wasn't as grimy as he expected. No rust-stained footprints, no moisture rot. The air was warm, warmer than it should have been. Something was running. As he stepped deeper into the station, the door behind him sealed with a soft click. He didn't flinch, just kept moving. His boots echoed too cleanly on the floor. No debris, no drag marks, no signs of struggle, just that same antiseptic sterility. The datapad in his hand blinked, soft green pulses mapping his route to the cargo hold, sub-level 4. Bryce had done runs like this before, post-war cleanups, scavenger routes, fertility theft. Most facilities had long since been stripped, their test tubes emptied, their subjects sold to the highest bidder, or quietly terminated when profit dropped. But something about this place felt wrong. It wasn't just that it was still functioning, it was too functional. He passed a sealed door, then another, and another, each labeled in both human common and an alien dialect, fluid, looping script he didn't recognize. No windows, no sound, but he could feel the hum beneath his feet, the low throb of machines still cycling, breathing, waiting. Bryce's hand drifted near his sidearm. He didn't know what he expected, leftover technicians, security drones, fail-safes. Instead, he got silence, a silence so thick it made the skin on his neck tighten. The tracker pinged again, pointing him toward the last wing of the corridor. He took one more step and stopped. To his left, a panel of reinforced glass shimmered dully in the flickering light. It was the only window he'd seen on this level. No markings, no label, just a single rectangular viewport embedded in the wall. He would have walked past if not for the subtle shift inside. Movement. He turned. Behind the glass, she stood motionless. A woman, or something like one, naked, silent, blue-skinned. Her skin was a soft, dusky azure, taut over sharp collarbones, marred by faded scars and faint impressions from past restraints. Her long black hair hung like wet silk, falling forward to hide most of her face. But her eyes, dark, massive, and depthless, were watching him. Not surprised, not curious, just watching. She didn't speak, didn't gesture, didn't seem to breathe. Bryce's hand tightened around the grip of his weapon, not out of threat but out of instinct. There was something wrong about the stillness, something manufactured. He glanced at his datapad. No life sign registered, no signal, no cargo tag. She wasn't on the manifest, wasn't supposed to exist, yet here she was. Inside the room, she didn't move, didn't retreat. Her arms hung loose at her sides. Her knees were slightly bent, like she'd been standing in that exact spot for hours, or days, or longer. He stepped closer. The glass separated them by less than a foot now. Her eyes flicked to meet his, and something old stirred in Bryce's chest. Something dusty and unwelcome. She looked used, not broken, not mad, just hollow. There was a faint redness around her wrists, faint bruises at her hips, old marks, like straps had held her still for far too long. She bore them like part of her skin now. Her ribs were visible, her lips cracked, her breathing shallow and mechanical, just enough to live, no more. The room behind her was white, spotless, empty. Not a cell, not quite a lab. Something in between. Something meant to hold, not care. Bryce leaned closer. There, near her collarbone, burned into her skin, was a brand, a numeric code, barely healed, seared too deep for the skin to forget. 5 digits. No name. They hadn't even given her a name. The floor beneath his boots vibrated slightly. An internal pulse from the station's AI facility purge in 0634. His heart ticked faster. Whatever was left in this place, the system was preparing to destroy it. He should go. He should walk away, grab the marked embryos, and get back to his ship. The job was simple, clean, profitable. Instead, he found himself pressing his palm to the glass. "Can you hear me?" he asked, his voice low. She didn't answer, but her eyes didn't leave him. "Do you know what's happening?" Still nothing. He opened the wall panel beside the door. The access controls blinked red, locked, but old tech, basic encryption. He could override it. He hesitated. Why? Why was he doing this? Because something in those eyes reminded him of things he'd buried, faces of the war, prisoners they'd never reached, ghosts in shattered bunkers calling for help too late. This one wasn't too late. His fingers flew across the screen. The door hissed. Inside, the air hit him like a punch. Hot, stale, cloying. She didn't react. Her skin shimmered with sweat, no ventilation, no movement, just the humming of dead machines and the faint crackle of overhead lights. Bryce stepped in, slowly, hands visible, careful. She still didn't move, but something in her chest rose, a breath, shallow, sharp. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said. Still silence. He stepped closer, 1 pace, then 2. Her head tilted slightly. No fear in her eyes, not yet, but no trust either. He reached into his coat, pulled out the emergency thermal wrap, and held it out. "Here, it's warm." She didn't take it. So he moved slowly, inch by inch, closing the space between them. Then he touched her, a light graze on her shoulder. The reaction was immediate and brutal. She shrank away like she'd been hit. Her body convulsed, not just a flinch, but a full-body recoil. Breath caught in her throat. Her eyes widened in terror. Her knees gave slightly. She didn't cry out, didn't scream. She just stared at the point of contact like it was acid. Bryce froze. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm sorry." She looked at him, shivering. And he realized no one had ever touched her without taking something. He didn't reach for her again, just set the wrap on the bench beside her. "You don't have to come with me," he said, "but if you stay, you die. The purge will start in 5 minutes." He turned, walked to the door, didn't look back. Every step away felt heavier than the last. It wasn't logic. It wasn't conscience. It was something older, something primal. The part of a man that couldn't stand the weight of another unfinished ghost. He reached the corridor. The lights flickered overhead. He heard the distant groan of turbines spooling up. AI waking the burn engines, preparing to cleanse the station of biological waste. He was halfway up the ramp of the ashfall when he heard it. The soft, dragging sound of bare feet on steel. He turned. She stood there, wrapped in the blanket, her hair veiling half her face. She didn't speak. She didn't reach out. She just watched him. Then, one step, then another, and another. Bryce didn't say anything, didn't ask her why. He just stepped aside, let her pass. And in silence, she entered the ship. The ship's engine hummed low beneath the floor, a steady vibration that made the silence feel louder. Bryce sat in the cockpit of the ashfall, elbows on his knees, staring out at the endless sprawl of space. He hadn't said a word since departure. There hadn't been anything to say. Behind him, through the narrow corridor, the woman sat curled in the small med bay, wrapped in the emergency thermal blanket, knees drawn to her chest, back pressed against the far wall. She hadn't moved in over an hour, barely blinked. She hadn't spoken, not a sound since she'd stepped aboard. Bryce didn't expect her to. Whatever had been done to her, however long she'd been locked in that room, it had carved the voice out of her, maybe permanently. He leaned back in the pilot's chair, sighing through his nose. The nav screen displayed a fractured cluster of debris fields and inactive relay buoys. Dead systems, no patrols, perfect for hiding, but not for healing. They had nowhere to go, no plan. The job was trashed, the client wouldn't wait, and the ashfall had less than a week's worth of untainted fuel left in her tanks. Still, Bryce had brought her. Against every instinct, every rule he'd spent years living by, he'd opened that door. He'd looked into her eyes and made a choice. Why? That question had circled his thoughts like a vulture, because he'd seen others like her, too late. During the war, he'd moved through scorched colonies and shattered medical stations, always arriving after the damage had already been done. He remembered one site on Bract 4, rows of cribs, all empty. The air still smelled like scorched synth cloth and flesh. They'd sterilized the entire complex before pulling out, burned the bodies, cleansed the record. They said it was protocol. Bryce had nodded back then, kept walking, but this time, he'd been on the other side of the door. And this time, she had still been breathing. He stood and moved quietly down the corridor. The ship creaked faintly with his steps, metal cooling after the heat of departure. He stopped at the medbay doorway. She didn't look up. Her long black hair veiled half her face. Her hands were hidden beneath the wrap. One shoulder, barely covered, showed a faint discoloration, a bruised line in the shape of a restraint. Her skin was more luminous now that she was off that station. Not glowing, just alive. She was curled in on herself like someone who didn't know how to take up space, like she thought being small enough might make her disappear. "You should drink something," Bryce said, voice low. Not commanding, just audible. No reaction. He took a step in, slowly, set a hydration pouch on the counter and backed off again. Still nothing. Bryce watched her for a moment longer, then turned away, heading toward the hold to check the emergency stores. He'd barely taken 5 steps when a sound stopped him. Barely audible, a breath. He turned his head. She hadn't spoken, but she had shifted, just slightly. Her fingers had emerged from beneath the blanket, one hand trembling, reaching. Not for him, not for help, for the water. It took her several seconds to grab it, even more to open it. She spilled a third of it down her arm before bringing it to her lips. Bryce didn't move, didn't speak. She drank slowly, lips barely parted, eyes fixed on the floor. And then, just as slowly, she sank back against the wall. But he'd seen it, the choice, small, almost invisible, but it was hers. Later that night, the ashfall dropped out of hyperspace near an abandoned mining colony, orbiting a fractured ice world. It was the safest spot Bryce could think of. An old fueling station tucked beneath a glacier ridge, shielded from satellite sweeps. No one came out here anymore. No reason to. The ice was unstable, the atmosphere thin, the ground long since picked clean. He landed the ship in silence. Inside the cockpit, the temperature gauges flickered. Systems were holding, for now. He checked the external sensors, scanned the atmosphere, then powered down the ship to minimum life support. Cloaking engaged, communications locked. They'd be ghosts for at least a day or two. He moved back down the corridor. The woman hadn't moved much, but her posture was different now. Not fully upright, but not collapsed either. She looked at him this time, not directly, but near enough. He set a small ration tray on the ledge across from her. "No meat," he said quietly. "Wasn't sure if you..." He let the sentence trail off. She didn't reach for it, but she didn't flinch either. "I'm going to step outside, check for geothermal leaks. You're safe here." Again, no answer. Bryce walked past her, pressing the airlock open. The cold that hit him was immediate, bitter, but not deadly. The suit compensated fast enough. He scanned the ridge, set portable sensors, and swept the perimeter. The ice cracked beneath his boots. Old structures lay half-submerged in the distance, metal ribs poking through the frost, long buried memories of the war. He paused near one, brushing snow off a collapsed doorframe. Inside, just shadows and broken panels. But something caught his eye. A mural, half-faded, scrawled in an alien script along the wall. It wasn't military, it was art, children's handprints. He swallowed. Back on the ship, he removed his helmet and hung his coat. His bones ached from the cold, but he ignored it. She was still in the medbay, still awake. He leaned against the doorway. "I'm Bryce," he said finally. She blinked. "Not that it matters, but I figure if you're going to be stuck with me, you should at least know my name." No reaction. He smiled without humor. "You probably think I'm just another thief. And you're not wrong. I've done things that make the stories look polite. But I didn't bring you here to hurt you." Still nothing. "I don't want anything from you." At that, her head tilted, slightly. Barely. But he saw it. "I'll get you somewhere safe. Don't know where yet, but I will." He turned. But before he stepped out, her voice, small, raw, broke the silence. Not words, not language, just a sound, software, hoarse. Bryce froze. He didn't turn around, didn't push, just stood there. After a breath, he nodded once and walked away. In the cold between stars, something had shifted. She had made another choice. The quiet inside the ashfall was different now. It wasn't the silence of survival, the kind Bryce was used to. This silence carried something more fragile. Not emptiness, but tension. The thin, stretched stillness of two people in the same space, separated by memory, pain, and everything they weren't yet ready to say. He hadn't slept much. Not because of nightmares, they came and went like weather, but because of that sound she'd made the night before. Not a word, just a rasp. Something involuntary, cracked from a throat not used in too long. But it had shattered something inside him more than any scream could have. She was still in the medbay when morning came, knees pulled to her chest, the emergency blanket clutched around her like armor. Her eyes were open, unfocused, staring into the middle distance. Bryce stood in the doorway for a while, uncertain. Then he stepped forward and crouched down, slow. "I brought food," he said softly. No response, not even a blink. He set the ration pack beside her and backed off, let her see him move away, let her breathe without his presence pressing in. She didn't touch the food. That was okay. He hadn't expected her to. He just sat down on the opposite wall and waited. 10 minutes passed, then 15, and then slowly, without lifting her head, her hand slid from beneath the blanket. Fingers curled weakly. She reached. She didn't eat. Not yet. But she opened the packet and sniffed it. Her face didn't change. Still, it was something. Bryce stayed quiet. The woman who now lived in his ship and in his thoughts was not the person she'd been made to be. That much was clear. He remembered the room where he found her, the way she stood like a forgotten statue, too empty even to flinch, the way she hadn't looked up when the glass opened, as if she'd stopped expecting anything different, as if she'd learned the glass never opened for her. Now here she was, moving, breathing, choosing, slowly, cautiously, but not broken, not yet. Bryce reached into his jacket and pulled out a thin, well-worn multi-tool, a habit. Fixing things helped him think, made the world feel a little less frayed. He set the tool on the floor and began working on a faulty plasma coil from the ship's backup systems. Loose paneling, scorched contact points. It wasn't urgent, but it gave his hands something to do, gave her something to observe. She watched him, not openly, not obviously, but her eyes flicked toward his hands every so often. He said nothing, didn't explain, just worked. Then, so softly it could have been imagined, she moved. Her hand brushed the floor, not reaching for anything, just existing in the same space as his, a small thing. But Bryce knew better than to overlook small things. "I used to fix these during the war," he said, still focused on the coil. "Sometimes while being shot at. My old commander would scream at me to hurry, and I'd be holding a torch between my teeth trying not to melt my face off." He gave a low chuckle. It didn't sound amused. Back then it was all numbers, orders, coordinates, targets. He looked up. But there were people too. I remember their faces, not their names, just the way they looked at me when I got there too late. She didn't react. He didn't expect her to, but her breathing shifted, shallow, faster. And then, suddenly, sharply, she spoke, just one word. "Designation." Bryce froze. His eyes met hers. She wasn't looking at him. Her gaze was somewhere far away, somewhere deeper. "What?" he asked gently. Her voice was dry, gravel soft, like it had been buried in her throat for years. "My name," she said. "They called it a designation. I didn't get a name." Bryce's heart sank. He sat upright, tools forgotten. "What did they call you?" She closed her eyes. Her voice cracked as she said it. "Subject N43 Delta, carrier compatible." Each syllable landed like a knife on concrete. "They didn't look at me. Not really. Just the inside. Ovarian data, uterine lining, compatible, repeatable, fertile." Her hands were trembling now, fingers clenched in the fabric of the blanket. "They marked it on the wall, my cycle. How many they took, how many survived. The rest were discarded." Bryce felt his mouth go dry. His body remained still, but his mind screamed. "How long?" he asked, the words nearly catching in his throat. "I don't know," she whispered. "There was no time, no seasons, just light and pain, sometimes sedation, mostly not." She opened her eyes. "They told me I was lucky, that I was still useful. They said others were recycled. I didn't ask what that meant. I didn't want to know." She looked at him, and for the first time her eyes were not distant. They were clear, focused, angry. They kept me awake, Bryce. The sound of her saying his name hit like a fist to the chest. Sometimes they kept me awake through the births. He couldn't move. She was shaking now, not violently, but visibly, like her body was trying to remember how to be alive. I didn't see them, the children. I only heard them cry, once, then gone. She swallowed hard. After a while, I didn't want to hear them anymore. A long silence fell. Bryce wanted to say something, anything, but there were no words for this. Nothing that wouldn't sound empty. So he did the only thing he could. He reached out slowly and set his hand on the floor between them. Palm up, not asking, just offering. She looked at it. For a long, long time. Then her fingers slid from beneath the blanket. Thin, cold, scarred. And she placed her hand in his. Not tightly, not trust, not yet, but a choice. Bryce said nothing. Neither did she. But for the first time, her hand didn't flinch. And in that small, trembling silence, something fragile began to live. The moment her hand touched his, something shifted in the space between them. Not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet rearranging of gravity. Bryce didn't tighten his fingers around hers. He didn't pull her close or speak. He simply let his palm remain where it was, open and steady, and for a long time, she kept her hand there too. Her skin was cold, her touch hesitant, but she didn't recoil. That alone meant more than anything he could have said. Later that night, the storm rolled in. Not from outside, the ice moon remained calm under a blanket of stillness, but from inside the ashfall, a mechanical tremor. One of the auxiliary power cells overloaded in the lower deck, sending a jolt through the ship's belly and triggering a cascade of flickering lights overhead. The emergency systems clicked on, casting the ship in red-gold pulses. Bryce was on his feet in seconds, already pulling tools from a wall panel and sprinting down the hall. She followed without a word. Not because he told her to. Not out of panic. She just moved with him, barefoot, the blanket dragging behind her like a shadow of who she'd been. Down in the lower deck, the smell of scorched circuitry filled the narrow space. Bryce cursed under his breath, shoved open a panel, and knelt over the sparking junction. The heat kissed his skin, and sweat beaded across his brow. "Come on, not now," he muttered, voice strained. Behind him, she watched. And then, for the first time, she knelt beside him. Bryce didn't look at her. He didn't need to. She was there, close enough that he could feel her breath. He passed her a stabilizer clamp, didn't explain. She took it without hesitation. The red warning lights cast a strange glow over her skin, making her look like something born of flame and smoke. Her eyes never left the tool, never wavered, even as sparks popped against her arm. She didn't flinch. 10 minutes passed, then 15. The smell of burning softened and the power relay held steady. The hum evened out. They sat back against the wall, both breathing hard. Bryce let out a laugh, soft, bitter, but real. "Well, guess we didn't explode. That's progress." She glanced at him, her face unreadable. Then she said, "You didn't scream." Bryce blinked, caught off guard. "What?" "In the room, before, when the door opened." Her voice was hoarse, but clearer than before. "You didn't shout orders. You didn't touch me like the others did." He met her eyes. She looked down. "I kept waiting for it," she said. "For the yelling, the commands, the pain." She drew her knees up to her chest, but it never came. Bryce leaned back, wiping a streak of soot from his cheek. "That's not who I am anymore," he said. Then, almost as an afterthought, "Not sure I ever was." She was silent for a long moment. Then, almost in a whisper, "They used to speak in numbers. Never names. If I cried, they wrote it down like a malfunction." She paused. "Once, I sang to myself." He looked at her again, surprised. It was a sound I didn't recognize. It came out of me without warning. It felt warm, like something real. One of the techs heard. He slapped me so hard I bled from my ear. Bryce's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. I stopped making sounds after that. She tilted her head against the wall. The silence became easier than remembering what it felt like to be heard. Bryce didn't speak. Not right away. He understood the kind of pain that lived in silence. The kind that didn't scream or shatter, just stayed. Quiet, heavy. "I don't need you to speak," he said softly. "But if you want to, I'll always listen." Her eyes flicked toward him, then away. They didn't go back to the med bay. They stayed there on the floor of the lower deck, beneath flickering lights and rusted pipes, in the heartbeat of a ship that refused to die. She leaned her head gently against his shoulder. It wasn't affection. Not yet. It was permission. And Bryce, battle-hardened and hollowed out by years of gray choices and colder silences, felt something ignite in his chest. Not desire, not even hope. Something quieter, like a fire warming long-abandoned walls. He turned his face slightly toward her, close enough to feel the brush of her hair against his skin. "You're not a designation," he whispered. "You never were." She closed her eyes. For the first time, her hand found his, not because he offered it, but because she reached. And when she whispered his name this time, it didn't sound like survival. It sounded like trust. She dreamed of light again, not the warm kind, not sun or fire. This light was sharp, flat, and endless. It didn't fall on the body. It cut through it. A white so sterile it erased everything beneath it. Then came the cold. Not environmental cold, not weather or winter. It was the kind that bloomed from inside, a chill born from being watched, measured, and never seen. She was back on the table, steel against bone, wires snaking from her temples, ankles spread, wrists locked, the familiar hum of the operating arm above her head. She couldn't remember how many times she'd lain there, because remembering meant giving shape to pain. She had stopped counting after the 5th, or the 15th. She wasn't sure. Her body tensed in the dream. The breath caught in her throat, something in her bones remembered before her mind did. Hands gloved in translucent plastic moved across her belly. The technicians didn't speak to her, not directly. Their voices existed only above her, around her, never for her. Subject N43 Delta, genetic yield still viable. She's young. Ovary samples are regenerating at pace. Let her rest 12 hours between cycles. No sedation. Sedation inhibits fetal variation. Let's see what she can withstand. A click, a tone, a pressure. Her mouth opened, but she made no sound. She never screamed anymore. It had stopped mattering. Then came the voice, the one that always haunted her. "You are not a person. You are a vessel." And then, just as always, the dream let go, but it never let her fall gently. She woke with a jolt, back arching, breath ragged in her throat. The room spun, walls too close, ceiling too low, air too warm. Sweat soaked her skin. She was on the floor. Somehow she had crawled off the bed in her sleep, fists clenched in her hair, nails biting into her scalp. She couldn't stop the shaking, couldn't stop the scream building inside her chest, except it didn't come out. It never came out. Her body had forgotten how to make that sound. The door opened. Bryce. He didn't speak at first, just stepped in quietly, crouching beside her, his presence low and steady like he'd done this before. "Hey," he said gently, "you're here. It's not real. You're with me." She didn't answer. Her fingers dug deeper into her scalp. Bryce didn't reach out, not right away. He waited until her breath hitched, until her body began to fold in on itself like collapsing steel. Then he touched her shoulder. Her reaction was immediate, sharp, instinctive. A flinch so full body it nearly knocked her backward. But before she could escape, her hands found his shirt and held on, hard. She buried her face into the crook of his neck, her body trembling as if her skin couldn't contain what lived beneath it. Bryce wrapped his arms around her, slowly, like she might break if he moved too fast. He didn't speak again. He didn't need to. He just stayed. Her breathing was ragged against his chest, short gasps, silent sobs. Her fists curled into the fabric of his shirt, not with fear, but desperation, like he was the only thing anchoring her to now. When the shaking slowed, she spoke. "I was awake." 2 words, barely formed, but they hit like shrapnel. Bryce held her a little tighter. "They told me sedation was wasteful. That real endurance created better results, better mutations." She pulled back slightly, eyes meeting his. There were 27. Bryce didn't ask what that number meant. She told him anyway. Implantations, extractions, births, not all of them reached term, but they still counted. Her voice was fading, not from hesitation, but from sheer exhaustion. "I was 14 when they started." He felt something tighten behind his ribs, a slow, sick pull of empathy and fury. But she wasn't done. "Before that," she whispered, "they studied, measured, fed me synthetics, ran tests." She paused, then, "I was 9 when they took me." Bryce closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them again. "That's young," he said quietly. She nodded, just once. "How long were you in the facility?" Her gaze fell away. "Long." Bryce didn't push. Instead, he shifted his weight, sat back against the doorframe, one leg stretched out across the floor. He let silence fill the space again, not the sharp kind, but the kind that settles when people have stopped pretending. She watched him, not with fear, not with trust, but with something like disbelief, like she couldn't quite accept that he hadn't left yet. Bryce looked at her. When they put armor on me, I was 19. Her head tilted slightly, but she didn't speak. Our colony didn't ask. They conscripted, said we owed blood to the system. That war was the price of being fed. Still, no response. But her eyes didn't leave his. I wasn't a hero, he said. I followed orders. I shot things that moved too fast. I patched myself up when no one else would. He rubbed a hand across the back of his neck. When the war ended, they left us there. Just like that. No payment. No way home. Just empty fields and ration packs that expired 5 years ago. He didn't expect her to understand. But she didn't look away. We're not the same, he said. But I know what it's like to be used, then discarded. A long silence followed. But this one didn't hurt. It didn't close anything. It opened something. She shifted closer to him, just slightly, a fraction. You didn't touch me like they did, she said softly. I never will. Her fingers found his again. Not for warmth, not for fear, but for truth. And when she finally leaned into him, not collapsed, not broken, but present, Bryce realized something had changed. She wasn't clinging to survive. She was choosing to stay. Bryce stood in the galley, hands wrapped around a steaming tin mug. The recycled heat of the ashfall hissed through the walls, barely keeping the cold of the ice moon at bay. Beyond the forward viewport, the world outside lay silent and silver, endless plains of fractured crystal that reflected starlight like shattered glass. Inside, it was quiet, not empty, not anymore. She sat in the co-pilot's chair, curled with her knees drawn to her chest. Her eyes weren't downcast now. They scanned the stars as if trying to decipher them, as if some message had been scrawled into their arrangement that she alone could read. Bryce hadn't spoken since waking. There was no need. Words didn't fill this kind of space. They moved through it carefully, giving each other room, breathing in the stillness between them, like shared air. She looked different this morning, not new, not healed, but anchored. A shift in her shoulders, the way she held her own weight. Like something inside her had straightened, stood up. A spine that had once been curled in shame now began to remember how it once bore its own shape. Bryce stepped forward slowly, mug in one hand, the other carrying a small data slate. She turned her head as he approached, not startled, just attentive. I thought you might want this, he said, handing her the slate. She took it, brows furrowing slightly. What is it? Her voice still rasped, but it had found rhythm, breaths that didn't trip over trauma. A blank registry form, he said, off-grid. No one will see it unless you send it, which you won't, unless you choose to. She ran her fingers along the edge of the slate, feeling the smoothness, the silence of it. It's clean, he continued. No code, no serial, just a space for a name. She looked up at him. He didn't push, just sat down beside her and took a sip from his mug. A pause stretched between them, soft but charged. I never had one, she said finally. I know. They gave me numbers, stripped them, gave new ones. I stopped memorizing them after the 4th reclassification. Her thumb hovered over the field labeled Identity. Will it feel like lying, she asked, if I choose one? Bryce turned his head toward her, studying the curve of her jaw in the light. No, he said. It'll feel like choosing. That's different. She didn't speak again, just stared at the field. Silent seconds passed. Then she typed, one slow letter at a time. K-A-E-L-E-N. Bryce read the name as she did. He didn't smile, but something in his expression warmed, like a door cracking open to morning air. That's beautiful, he said. It's not from anywhere, she replied quietly. It doesn't mean anything. It does now, he said. Kalen, not subject, not carrier, not N43 Delta. Kalen. He said it aloud once, just to feel how it moved in the air. She closed the slate, setting it aside, and then, without being asked, without needing permission, she leaned her shoulder against his, not to collapse, not to hide, just to be. But the moment didn't last. The proximity alarm chirped, soft but unmistakable. Bryce tensed immediately. He rose, crossed the cockpit, and tapped the console. The screen blinked to life, showing a low-orbit object descending from high atmosphere. Not a meteor, not debris, too slow, too controlled. A ship, one not broadcasting an ID. Not good, Bryce muttered. Kaylin stood behind him now, her blanket forgotten, her face hardening in a way that wasn't fear. It was memory. Bryce turned. Go to the back, prep the med locker, and close off the auxiliary bay. I'm not hiding, she said. He met her eyes. I know. But he didn't argue. She moved quickly, silently. Bryce powered down external emissions, rerouted backup systems, and watched the ship descend lower and lower into the edge of the atmosphere. Sleek hull, black livery, no insignia, military grade, but not government issue, corporate. He clenched his jaw. He knew that design. Varkari-class courier, short-range interceptor, fast, quiet, efficient, a retrieval unit. They hadn't forgotten her. They had just waited. The ship touched down half a kilometer away, kicking up frozen dust. Bryce moved through the ashfall like a ghost, grabbing his rifle, switching on shield dampeners, checking breech locks. When he returned to the main corridor, Kaylin was waiting. She had a knife in one hand. Nothing elegant, just a standard alloy blade from the galley. But she held it with intent. You're not staying here, Bryce said. I'm not running. Their eyes locked. She wasn't trembling. She wasn't retreating. She was choosing again. Then we fight, he said. Outside boots crunched against frost. A silhouette appeared on the outer scan. Human, or something dressed to look that way. One figure, maybe more behind. Bryce and Kaylin stood side by side just inside the ramp. The steel beneath their feet groaned in the cold. I'll distract them, he said quietly. No, she answered. They want me. Exactly. She turned toward him. They took everything from me, but they don't get this. What's this? She looked at him, steady, clear. My name. And for the first time, he saw not a prisoner, not a victim. He saw Kaylin. The wind howled across the frozen ridge as the figure stepped into view. Kaylin stood in front of the ashfall, her blade low, her feet planted in the snow like roots. Behind her, Bryce shifted his rifle, watching the stranger's every move. They had come for her, one of them, but not alone. Drones buzzed silently just outside the scanner's edge, masked in stealth. That meant surveillance, extraction, termination if necessary. She wasn't going to be extracted. The stranger stopped 10 meters away. He raised his arm. Subject N43, the voice boomed through his suit speaker. You are to surrender immediately under corporate property recall protocol. Compliance ensures survival. Kaylin didn't answer. Bryce did. He fired first, shoulder shot, meant to disorient. The figure staggered, surprised but not dropped. The impact flared against his armor, leaving a shallow scorch. The return fire came fast. A pulse round zipped past Kaylin's head. She didn't flinch. She ran. Snow exploded beneath her steps. The blade in her hand glinted once, and then she was inside the attacker's range, low and fast. The man brought his weapon up, but she was already twisting, blade carving through the joint seam under the arm. Bryce flanked left, firing a second round, this time at the exposed hip. It hit. The man's leg buckled. He turned, swung his elbow into Kaylin's side. She absorbed the hit, staggered but didn't fall. He reached for her hair, stupid, predictable. She drove the knife under his chin. A wet gasp escaped his helmet. His weapon fell from limp fingers. Bryce didn't wait. He fired once more, clean and final, into the chest plate. The man crumpled. Kaylin backed away, blood streaking the edge of her blade, her breath fogging the air. Bryce stepped up, rifle still raised, scanning for movement. But nothing else came. The drones had vanished, or had never been there. The only sound now was the quiet hiss of the man's cooling armor. Kaylin knelt slowly beside the body, her shoulders rising and falling, not shaking, breathing. She wiped the blade clean on the snow. Bryce watched her for a long moment, then stepped back, and the frost whispered beneath his boots as he turned away. Smoke curled up from the attacker's chest plate. The impact had cracked the armor's housing, revealing tangled microfiber wiring and pulsing circuitry still spitting sparks. Bryce crouched beside it, pressing 2 fingers into the broken side panel. A data ring, thin, black, and still warm from neural heat, slid free with a click. He held it up. Kaylin approached slowly, her expression unreadable, but her eyes sharp. Is that what they were tracking me with? She asked. No, Bryce said. It's a memory core, probably mission briefings, field logs. Could be encrypted, but let's see. He plugged it into the auxiliary terminal at the cockpit. The screen flickered for a moment, then stabilized, illuminating the small space in blue light. A voice played, flat, machine-like. Mission objective, high-value genetic asset retrieval. Subject N43, now alias Kaylin. Reason, genome classification, type Zeta hybrid, compatibility profile. 99.89% across Class A species. Note, subject believed terminated during facility Delta collapse. Recovered by rogue ex-military operative. Status, irreplaceable. Directive, return alive. Use lethal force as required. The words hung in the air like poison. Bryce stared at the screen. They didn't come because you escaped, he said. They came because you survived. Kaylin's breath shook, just once. They want to start again, she said. Continue the breeding cycles, but not just with me. They want to manufacture what I am. Bryce turned toward her. You're not a blueprint. They think I'm the original copy. She looked down at her hands, fingers curled loosely. The mistake they can't replicate. Bryce stood slowly, his shoulders tense. They won't get another chance. She didn't answer, just looked past him, through the viewport, toward the stars. Then, after a long silence, she said, I'm tired of running. He nodded. So we stop. The console chirped softly. The enemy ship's transponder was still active, idling, unmanned. Bryce tapped through the interface, overriding its controls, searching for whatever breadcrumbs it had followed. And there it was, a relay transmission, short range, encrypted in corporate code shorthand. The origin was buried behind layers of rerouted signal paths, but the message was clear. Subject is alive, asset recoverable. Stage 2 ready. He deleted it, then sent one back. Subject deceased. Operation failed. Do not pursue. He severed the uplink manually, burning out the node with a surge of power that lit the console with a flash. Sparks hissed and died. Bryce exhaled and leaned back against the panel. Kaylin stepped closer. You could have walked away, she said. At the facility after, even now. I didn't want to. Why not? Bryce turned to face her fully. Because I saw you. She blinked. Not what they turned you into. Not what they wanted to use. You. And I knew right then that if I left you there, I'd never be able to live with what was left of me. Kaylin said nothing for a long time. Then her hand reached out, not shaking, not hesitant, and touched his cheek. Her fingers were cool, steady. Bryce leaned into the touch, like it was the first time he'd been touched with care in years. Her voice dropped to a whisper. You don't own me. I know, he said. You didn't rescue me. I didn't. You didn't fix me. I couldn't. But you stayed. I did. And then she kissed him. It wasn't soft. It wasn't gentle. It was quiet but fierce, real. The kind of kiss that doesn't ask for permission because it is permission. Bryce didn't flinch. He moved into her with equal heat, his hand rising to cradle the back of her neck, as if afraid she'd vanish again. But she didn't vanish. She anchored there, lips to lips, breath to breath. When they broke apart, she stayed close. I don't want to forget what happened to me, she said, but I don't want to live in it anymore. Bryce's voice was low. Then live outside it, with me. Her eyes searched his. And if they come again? They won't. But if they do... He reached behind him, took her hand and pressed it over his chest. We make sure they don't leave. Kaylin's smile was faint, but it reached her eyes. Later, the ashfall lifted from the ice moon. The retrieval craft exploded behind them. Bryce had triggered the overload remotely before launch. No one would salvage it. No signal would leak from its hull. Clean escape. They flew into unmarked space, beyond the edge of known trade routes. Black, endless, free. Kaylin stood at the front viewport, arms folded, watching the stars stretch. Bryce stepped beside her. No course logged, he said. Good, she replied. You want to choose a direction? She glanced at him. This time I do. He smiled. Pick anything. She pointed to a distant nebula, half-shrouded, luminous, unpredictable. There. Bryce set the course. Kaylin reached for his hand, interlacing her fingers through his, and together they faced forward, toward something new, not a destination, a future. And behind them, in the cold silence of a forgotten galaxy, the last echo of a stolen name faded into nothing. Kaylin, not owned, not tracked, not broken, just hers. The planet had no name on the charts. To the trade routes, it was nothing, just a quiet moon with breathable air, glowing trees, and no reason to land. To Kaylin and Bryce, it was everything. They called it Hollow Green. Here they were untracked, unclaimed, unchased. Here they lived. Kaylin moved barefoot through the cabin doorway, the morning sun painting her skin in soft gold. She held a ceramic mug between her hands, steam curling up into the quiet air. The trees beyond shimmered in the light. their bioluminescent branches swaying gently, casting dancing patterns across the wooden floor. Inside, Bryce stood over the stove, humming a tune with no origin and no end. He stirred a pot of something warm and spicy. He'd found a new root in the valley outpost last week and insisted it was edible. Kaylin wasn't so sure, but she liked the smell, and she loved the way he whistled while pretending to cook. "You're watching me again," he said without turning. "I like the view," she replied. Bryce glanced back, grinning. "You're lucky I'm humble." She walked over and leaned on the counter beside him, her hip brushing against his. It didn't make her tense anymore, his nearness. It had become easy, familiar, chosen. "You still think about them?" Bryce asked softly. Kaylin didn't answer right away. She looked out through the window where morning light filtered through the trees in veins of gold and green. "Sometimes," she said, "but they feel far now, like another life, like a story someone else told." Bryce turned the heat off and poured the food into two mismatched bowls. "You want to eat outside?" She smiled. "Always." They took their breakfast onto the porch and sat on the edge of the wooden steps, feet dangling, sunlight warming their skin. Birds sang somewhere in the forest, strange and lilting. The air carried the scent of wet leaves and wildflowers. After a while, Bryce looked over at her. She was watching him, not in fear, not in waiting, just seeing him. And then she said it, soft, steady, with a voice that had once forgotten how to speak. "I love you." Bryce didn't move for a beat. Then he set his bowl aside, leaned forward, and kissed her, slow and tender, his hand at her jaw, her fingers curling into his shirt. There was no urgency in it, no desperation, just presence. When they parted, he whispered against her lips, "I love you too." They sat there until the sun climbed higher. There were no alarms, no countdowns, no names she didn't choose. Just this moment. Kaylin leaned her head against his shoulder and closed her eyes. She didn't dream of cold lights anymore. She dreamed of heat, of breath, of the way his voice sounded in the morning, raspy with sleep, of the sound of her name, not a code, not a label, but a truth. Kaylin, chosen, loved, free. And in that freedom, she realized something. Her story hadn't ended when she escaped the facility. It hadn't ended when they stopped running. It had begun when someone saw her as more than what she'd survived, and chose her anyway.